History often whispers before it screams. But some events, some leaders, change the course of the world so profoundly that their shadow still looms over us today. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth history analyses and untold stories from the past. History rarely announces catastrophe with a single dramatic gesture. More often, it advances step by step through calculated risks, diplomatic gambles, and political misjudgments until the consequences become irreversible. After consolidating power within Germany, Adolf Hitler turned his attention outward. His vision was not confined to domestic transformation. It centered on overturning the European order established after 1918 and constructing a German empire that would dominate the continent and extend deep into Eastern Europe. Once political opposition had been crushed and authority centralized, Hitler showed limited patience for routine domestic governance. Economic recovery, industrial mobilization, and social restructuring were important, primarily because they served a larger objective: preparing Germany for expansion. Central to that objective was dismantling the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Though Germany had already begun limited secret rearmament during the 1920s, the new regime accelerated these efforts with far greater ambition and less restraint. In October 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the International Disarmament Conference, signaling a decisive break from the post-war diplomatic framework. The move was framed domestically as a declaration of sovereignty. Internationally, it tested the resolve of Britain and France. Their protests were cautious and restrained, reinforcing Hitler's belief that the former Allied powers lacked the will to enforce Versailles by force. By 1935, the regime abandoned secrecy. Hitler publicly announced the existence of a new air force, the Luftwaffe, and the expansion of the army far beyond treaty limits. Conscription was reintroduced, reversing one of the most significant military restrictions imposed after World War I. The peacetime army was expanded into multiple corps and divisions, and training structures were reorganized to prepare a generation that had largely missed formal military service. These measures were justified as defensive necessities, but they represented a clear and deliberate repudiation of the post-war settlement. Remarkably, the reaction from Western Europe remained limited to diplomatic objections. In June 1935, Britain concluded a naval agreement permitting Germany to build a fleet up to one-third the size of the Royal Navy. Intended as a stabilizing compromise, the agreement effectively legitimized German naval rearmament and signaled further division among the former victors. The next bold step came in March 1936, when German troops entered the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized under international agreements. The military force involved was relatively small, and German commanders had orders to withdraw if confronted. No such confrontation occurred. The absence of resistance strengthened Hitler's domestic prestige and reinforced his assessment that calculated defiance would continue to succeed. Rearmament was accompanied by extensive public works and industrial mobilization. Infrastructure projects, including highways and armaments factories, reduced unemployment and stimulated economic growth. Military production expanded rapidly, improving Germany's strategic position. By the late 1930s, Germany had regained much of its pre-1918 standing as a major European power, though this resurgence rested increasingly on preparation for conflict. Hitler's foreign policy blended opportunism with long-term ideological ambition. While earlier German governments had sought revision of Versailles, his aims extended beyond territorial adjustment. He spoke openly to senior military leaders about the necessity of acquiring living space in the East. Eastern Europe, particularly territories under Soviet control, was envisioned as the foundation of a future German empire. Yet he recognized that immediate confrontation with multiple great powers would be disastrous. Strategy required sequencing.
To reduce immediate risks, Germany pursued a non-aggression pact with Poland in 1934, temporarily easing tensions along its eastern frontier. Meanwhile, relations with fascist Italy deepened. In 1936, after Italy's invasion of Ethiopia had strained its relations with Britain and France, Berlin and Rome moved closer. Their cooperation during the Spanish Civil War, supporting General Francisco Franco against the Spanish Republic, solidified ideological and military ties. By late 1936, the Rome-Berlin axis had emerged, and Germany joined Italy and Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact, directed against the perceived threat of international communism and the Soviet Union. Internal military leadership also shifted in early 1938 as key figures who expressed caution were removed. Authority over foreign and military policy became more centralized in Hitler's hands. Shortly thereafter, events accelerated dramatically. In March 1938, German forces entered Austria. Political pressure and intimidation paved the way for annexation, known as the Anschluss. Many Austrians welcomed union with Germany, though it violated explicit treaty prohibitions. Once again, international opposition proved limited. Encouraged by success, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a border region inhabited by millions of ethnic Germans. The crisis culminated in the Munich Agreement of September 1938, where Britain and France consented to the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany in hopes of preserving peace. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously returned, declaring, "Peace for our time." For Hitler, the agreement confirmed that bold demands backed by the threat of force could yield strategic gains without war. Yet the occupation of the remaining Czech territories in March 1939 marked a decisive turning point. Unlike previous moves, this action involved the takeover of non-German lands without even a pretense of ethnic unification. Britain and France concluded that Hitler's ambitions were not limited to revising Versailles, but extended towards continental domination. They pledged to defend Poland's sovereignty. Recognizing that a broader conflict was now likely, Hitler sought to avoid a two-front war. In May 1939, he formalized a military alliance with Italy, the Pact of Steel. In August, Germany stunned the world by signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The agreement included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This diplomatic maneuver temporarily neutralized the Eastern threat and cleared the way for action against Poland. Throughout this period, military planning often had to adapt rapidly to political decisions made at short notice. Hitler's confidence grew with each unopposed advance. Success in Austria and Czechoslovakia reinforced his belief that adversaries would continue to hesitate. He viewed diplomacy as a game of nerve, a game of pressure, threat, and calculated risk. By late summer 1939, preparations for invasion were complete. Senior military commanders were briefed on political and strategic objectives. While public rhetoric emphasized disputes over Danzig and the Polish corridor, internal discussions made clear that territorial expansion in the east was central to the plan. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war, transforming a regional crisis into a global conflict. The war that followed devastated Europe and ultimately Germany itself. Cities were destroyed, millions perished, and the nation was divided at war's end. The International Military Tribunal later assigned primary responsibility for the conflict to Hitler and his regime. In retrospect, it is evident that elements of Hitler's foreign policy echoed earlier German desires to revise Versailles and restore national strength. For several years, observers could plausibly interpret his actions as aggressive but conventional statecraft aimed at correcting perceived injustices. However, beneath that surface lay a far more radical vision, one rooted in racial ideology and expansionist doctrine that transcended traditional diplomacy. The progression from treaty revision to world war did not occur overnight. It unfolded through calculated defiance, strategic alliances, diplomatic gambles, and the repeated testing of international resolve. Each unchallenged step reduced constraints and emboldened further action. What began as a campaign to restore national power evolved into a bid for continental domination, and ultimately into one of the most destructive wars in human history.